Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We're overjoyed to be sharing in this great celebration of 30 years of Navigator work in South Africa. So I was asked to just try to shorten my presentation even more, just so that you would have enough time for further matters. So my connection with the Navigators, I think it was around about the early 90s to mid 90s, when the son of Billy Graham was planning to come over to the country to do a crusade, a very large evangelistic crusade. A number of us were invited. I'm a pastor in Lenasia, and I, together with a number of other pastors from all around the region, came together for that planning session. It was during that time that I met Bob. He was asked to head up the task team that would do the follow-up work. And it was marvelous just being mentored by him in that way. And then all of us who had that initial training went back to our various regions and began to then mobilize pastors and leaders for the crusade. It was a great crusade, as some of you might well remember. But during that time, there were times outside of the normal planning and preparation and mentoring where I got to know Bob a little better, got to know something of the work of the Navigators. Of course, in my reading, I'd always come across the Navigators. And he gave me the name of Dr. Oliobi and said that if ever in the future I needed, to know more and to be connected, here's the man to see. Well, fast forward many years later, I was just a young pastor at the time, didn't know much. And for pastors who've been around for a little while, we'll still tell you we don't know much even now after a few years. I thought when I just began to pastor that I was leading a group of well-seasoned people who loved Christ, people who've got their lives together, they were walking faithfully with the Lord. It took me just a short while to realize that that really wasn't true, that many of us were struggling with various things, some major things. And that got me to think about what was I going to be doing with this group of people. I had no idea. I was taught by my predecessor. I was trained as a young pastor, but I didn't quite know how to develop quality leaders, people who will stand through all the various tests of time. Now, I must tell you that during that time, I had, like so many of you, we scour bookshops, secondhand bookshops. I had on my shelf a book that is being sold here at your bookshelf, at your book table, The Lost Art of Disciple Making. I bought the book. It's really falling apart right now. It was on my shelf, didn't bother to read it, reflect on it, until that time when I began to be aware that I'm sitting in the midst of a challenge that I don't have the capacity to deal with. How do I raise up? First, not even leaders, how do I raise up faithful followers of Christ? And so I think this is probably true for many of us. It's almost like divine fortuitousness. Got to the bookshelf, pulled the book down, read it, discovered, my word, this seems to be the answer to the problem. Leroy Ames deals with the whole question of making disciples in the most structured way possible. That's my nature. I'm pretty structured. I liked the way he presented it. I saw the possibility of actually producing disciples, followers of Jesus Christ. There were two very telling illustrations, and the one illustration and a second is a factual story. The factual story, if you have a look at it on page 23, Leroy Ames talks about meeting a man who had been in a particular region as a missionary pastor, did things the way the book described it, established a church with all of its programs, thought he was doing what God called him to do. And there was another young man that had come into the region who seemed to be doing everything differently. This young man worked with a few people. He made disciples of them. The other man built the church. He ran the programs. He did everything that pastor's supposed to do. At the end of 15 years, he leaves the country, and he confesses to the author that it doesn't seem as though he's left anything behind. None of the people that he's trained have the capacity to train others. None of them can share the gospel. None of them can win another person to Christ. And on the other hand, the young man who seemed to have been doing everything wrong had left behind a small group of people who were among the most influential people imaginable, who had led hundreds to Christ. They had campus ministries. They had ministries within the business field. And so when I read that, I realized that seems to be me. I'm doing things the way the book, so-called, describes it, but doing it all wrong. And then went back to the real book and discovered Jesus said, make disciples. Don't add people to your church and just think that your job is done. And I was so surprised to discover, so I called Chris. And Chris said, thanks for calling, but the young man that's heading up the disciple-making ministry within churches is Philip Tobias. Please call him. Now, the name Philip Tobias in Johannesburg is a fairly well-known name. He was a paleontologist who taught at Wits University, and I thought, am I going to be talking to this illustrious man? And then I discovered that he is illustrious in his own right. Philip is a marvelous man. He met with me, met with the church leadership, and said to us, if you're serious about learning how to make disciples, you're going to have to try to forget a lot of things that you were trained in. It's not a quick fix. You're not going to be able to build your church quickly. It's long, it's difficult. But if you're prepared for the journey, he said to us, I'll be prepared to walk the journey with you. Well, to cut a long story short, Philip stayed with us at the church together with Stella. Their beautiful daughters were born during that 2-year period. They trained a number of leaders. We were able at that time also to see the need to take on some full-time people who would help advance the disciple-making ministry. As most will tell you, that it is a journey that is worth taking, but it's never a journey that ends easily. It's an ongoing work. And so we're in progress. We're working hard at it, but we're absolutely convinced that this is the right thing to do. And just to conclude, I found it, and still do, find it very surprising that the church, which was given the mandate to make disciples, are kind of lagging behind. So the Navigators works very closely in the early days with sailors, and then later with campus, with students on the campus and the business community. And it seems like the churches are so slow in taking this on board. And in all of my interaction with pastor friends, it still seems to be a struggle. They don't seem to see it as the thing that Christ has called us to do. As clear as it is in the scriptures, you can't be a follower of Christ just by coming to church. You have to be a disciple. So I'm very glad to be part of this great family of the Navigators and share in the joy of your 30 years together. Amen.